world had stopped behaving like it once did. The seasons no longer followed any predictable rhythm. Spring arrived briefly, only to be consumed by sudden infernos or bone-chilling frost. Rivers had dried 2 jagged beds of cracked clay, or swollen beyond recognition, devouring everything in their path. Where cities once stood proud and bustling, there were only the hollow shells of buildings, steel skeletons clawing at the sky. Windows shattered and frames twisted by relentless storms. The highways were fractured, their asphalt peeled and warped, leaving ghosts of vehicles rusting in place for years. The sky itself had become a permanent warning. It was no longer blue or grey, nor even the familiar purples and oranges of dusk. Instead, it was a constant angry swirl of reds and ochres, as though the atmosphere itself were burning from the damage humanity had inflicted. Dust storms carried, the scent of iron and decay filling every nostril, coating every exposed surface with grit. The sun, when it pierced through, seemed more a judgment than a star of fiery eye that offered light but no warmth. Small pockets of human life persisted, scattered like embers in the wasteland. The government had long since vanished, leaving behind empty bureaucracies and abandoned infrastructure. Hospitals, schools, and administrative centers were hollow monuments to a past society that no longer functioned. No organized protection remained. The rule of law had dissolved into the law of survival. Rogue factions now roamed freely, preying on the weak, scavenging supplies, and defending territories with brutal efficiency. Some bands tried to cling to humanity, forming fragile communities with shared gardens or water catchments, but trust was a dangerous commodity. Water was the most precious currency. Wells had run dry or become poisoned with runoff and contamination. Rain, when it came, was acidic, corrosive to both body and earth. Survivors learned to gather dew, to ration, to filter and boil every drop, knowing that one careless mistake could mean the end. Food scarcity was a constant ache in the belly, with edible plants, rare, and wildlife nearly extinct in many regions. Every trip outside was a gamble. Every shadow could conceal a scavenger, or worse, someone who had forgotten. Their humanity in the fight to survive. The transformation of familiar places was jarring. Parks, once places of laughter and greenery, were now barren expanses of dry soil and broken playgrounds. Schools were derelict fortresses, their hallways filled with debris, their classrooms silent. Supermarkets had become treasure vaults for scavengers, emptied long ago, leaving shelves of rotting packaging and shattered glass. Even the oceans were no longer recognizable. Tides carried pollution, oil slicks, and floating carcasses of creatures long gone from their natural habitat. Amid this chaos, some humans adapted. Nomadic bands traversed the wastelands with scavenged vehicles, trading knowledge, food, or protection for survival. Makeshift settlements had walls of corrugated metal and scavenged wood, with gardens cultivated from the tiniest scraps of soil and water carefully hoarded. Signals on radios were precious, a way to locate allies or warn against dangers. Every act of organization felt precarious, a fragile balance held together with grit and stubborn hope. Night brought its own terror. The absence of a stable climate meant nights could swing from freezing cold to suffocating heat within hours. Shadows lengthened and merged, making it impossible to tell where danger waited. Wildfires sometimes ignited spontaneously, fueled by the dry air and ember storms, consuming everything in minutes. And always, the wind carried whispers of movement another survivor, or someone far more dangerous, watching from the ruins. Civilization's remnants were scattered, relics of a world that had moved too fast and consumed itself. Libraries stood with their spines rotting and dust thick on every page. Bridges, once lifelines of transport and connection, were jagged ruins, their steel twisted and concrete crumbled. Vehicles, abandoned mid-escape, were now permanent fixtures. Of the landscape, their tires melted, paint peeled, interiors exposed to rain and sun. Yet even in this decay, humans clung to life. They scavenged the past to survive the present, transforming ruins into shelters, using whatever they could salvage to endure one more day. And in this world of desolation, the sky always warned of more to come. The future was uncertain, filled with the anticipation of storms, scarcity, and the ever-present threat of other desperate humans. Anxiety was a constant companion. The environment itself demanded vigilance and adaptability. Yet despite the devastation, life persisted. Small fires burned in hidden corners. Voices carried over the wind, faint but real, and somewhere, someone still listened to the crackle of a radio, hoping to hear that another ember of humanity still survived. Asterisk, I am Elias Mercer. That is what I call myself now, though I've often wondered if names still matter in a world like this. Once, I had more than a name. I had a life that felt infinite. A family, a home in the city where the lights never went out, a routine of meaningless comfort and safety. Now, those things are dust, scattered across a landscape that devours memory and hope alike. The streets I once walked are skeletal veins of cracked asphalt and broken concrete. My family's faces exist only in photographs, yellowed and curling. At the edges, tucked in a box I've hidden beneath the floorboards of this ruined apartment I still call home. Or maybe home is too generous a word. It is shelter, nothing more. 4 walls of crumbling brick that keep the wind from tearing at my skin at night and the rats from claiming me as one of their own. I survive because I must. There is no other choice. Hunger gnaws at the edges of consciousness every day. Water is the most precious substance on earth, and I have learned to ration it like a holy relic. I scavenge what I can: dusty canned goods, rotting vegetables from abandoned stores, the occasional cash left behind by someone who didn't make it. I hunt small creatures, rodents or birds, and cook them over fires I guard fiercely. Fire is life here. It warms me when the nights freeze my bones and keeps the predators of darkness at bay. Every day is a negotiation with death. Every breath is a victory. The radio is my only companion. Its hum, its static, the crackle of distant voices that may or may not exist. Listen to it as if it were human. I broadcast when I can, even though I rarely hear a reply. My voice is a whisper in the void, a thread of connection in a world severed from human contact. I speak to whoever will listen. I tell them what I see, what I hear, what I survive. Sometimes I imagine someone out there, another soul in the dust and ruin, tuning in, hearing my words, and finding a fragment of comfort in them. It is hope fragile, almost laughably small, but it keeps me moving forward. I remember the day the world shifted, though I will never forget it. The first fires tore through the outskirts of the city while the rivers receded, leaving behind nothing but cracked mud and a stench of rot. People panicked, looting, fighting, killing for scraps that would not last. I held my daughter in my arms that day, her small face streaked with soot, and I realized that I could not protect her from what was coming. We lost everything by nightfall. She is gone now, as are my wife and the friends who tried to cling to normalcy alongside me. I carry their absence like a stone in my chest. It is both a wound and a ballast, grounding me in the reality of survival. I have learned skills I never thought I would need. I can filter water through sand and charcoal, build a trap from scraps of metal and wire, recognize the telltale signs of approaching storms hours before the sky reveals them. I have memorized the locations of hidden caches left by those who were too hopeful or too foolish to carry their wealth with them. I can move silently through the empty streets, avoiding the scavengers who have forgotten decency, and the predators who stalk both man and beast alike. Knowledge is my shield, and it is all I have left besides my stubborn will to live. Yet survival alone is not enough. I survive not only for myself, but for the hope that someone else will hear my voice, that there might be another community, another set of eyes watching the horizon for the same fires and storms that I track. I survive because giving up would mean I erase the memory of those I loved, and I cannot do that. I survive because, even in this broken world, life has stubborn ways of insisting on itself. A seed sprouts through cracked concrete. A bird sings in a ruin. There is resistance, and in that resistance, I find reason to continue. Asterisk loneliness is a constant shadow. I speak aloud to myself sometimes, recounting my day or narrating the world as if someone is listening. The act of speaking keeps my mind from fracturing completely. At night, I write on scraps of paper, notes to whoever might come across them one day, warnings, instructions, scraps of knowledge, a record of life when life itself is scarce. I have become both archivist and witness, chronicling the slow collapse and the faint sparks of persistence that stubbornly cling to existence. There are moments when the weight becomes almost unbearable. A storm can trap me in the ruined apartment. For days, the wind howling like a chorus of angry ghosts outside. Hunger gnaws, water runs low, and the walls seem to shrink in around me. I think of the faces I have lost, the places I cannot return to, the laughter that will never echo again. Yet even in these moments, I find fragments of resilience. I focus on the next meal, the next turn of the generator crank, the next message, sent into the void, small victories, and they are enough to keep me alive. I have seen other survivors. Some are kind, wary companions who trade information or food. Others are ruthless, shadows moving in the night with knives or guns, willing to take anything they can claim. Trust is a dangerous currency, I have learned. To measure it carefully, but human connection is also necessary. Sometimes, just a shared glance across a desolate street, or a whispered acknowledgement of presence, can remind me that I am not entirely alone. That connection, however fleeting, fuels the fragile hope I carry within me every day. I walk the boundary between despair and endurance. I tally the storms, the dust, the smoke, the scarce rainfall, the sun that beats down like an accusing eye. I catalogue the dead, the ruins, the half-empty caches left by those who didn't survive. And through it all, I remind myself that life persists. That even in a world where time feels like it has stopped, and civilization teeters on the edge of memory, there is still a reason to breathe, to watch, to fight. I am not a hero. I am not particularly strong, or clever, or extraordinary. I am simply stubborn, and I remember. And that, in this world, is enough to survive another day. My survival is a quiet rebellion against the annihilation of everything I loved. It is a declaration that, even if the world has stopped, I will not, so I rise each morning, or at least I attempt to, as the red sky leaks through the cracks in the wall. I tend the generator, I check the water filters, I repair the tattered clothes that shield me from the cold, and I listen to the radio, speaking into the static, waiting, hoping, for someone to hear, for someone to know they are not alone, for a spark, no matter how small, to flare against the relentless dark. And as long as that hope exists, I will continue. I will continue to wander through the ruins, to scavenge, to endure. I will continue to speak, to remember, to survive. I am Elias Mercer, and though the world has fallen apart, my will has not. And perhaps, in that stubborn refusal to vanish, there is a reason for anyone listening to keep their own hope alive. Asterisk the Missouri River, once a ribbon of life threading through cities and farms, is now nothing more than a fractured scar on the earth. I walked along its cracked banks today, counting the fissures, noting where the mud had shifted with the wind. For 3 years, the sky has refused to give up even a single drop of water. The rains that once nurtured crops filled reservoirs and washed the streets clean have vanished, replaced by relentless heat that bakes the soil and saps every ounce of moisture from the air. The air itself feels like it is thickened, a hot, viscous blanket that sticks to skin and lungs alike. Each breath tastes of dust, iron, and desolation. This drought is not simply a season, it is the slow unraveling of the world I knew. The earth is becoming sterile in patches, rivers shrinking into trickles, ponds evaporating before the eye can trace their outlines. Crops fail before sprouting, livestock perish in their pens, and forests burn from the roots up, leaving behind skeletons of charred wood. Cities, too, have succumbed. Concrete and steel warp under the sun's endless glare. Buildings collapse under their own neglect. Streets are littered with the remnants of human ambition. Only the determined survive, and even then, barely. Survival has become a full-time occupation. I spend the mornings hunting water, tracking the hidden veins that occasionally yield something drinkable. Sometimes it is rainwater trapped in the hollow of a tree or collected in an abandoned cistern. Other times, I locate stagnant pools in the ruins of parks or municipal yards, testing them carefully before drinking. I carry a small, improvised filter of sand, charcoal, and cloth. Boiling comes next, a ritual I follow without fail. One mistake, one failure to purify, and the consequences are immediate. Diarrhea, fever, or worse, an infection can take a survivor faster than any storm. Food is even scarcer. I forage for what remains, grains sealed in tins, scavenged vegetables, rodents, birds, the occasional rabbit. Every animal is smaller, harder to catch, and more wary. I have learned to track footprints in dust, to recognize the whisper of movement in the still air, to anticipate the flight patterns of birds that may lead me to water or prey. It is exhausting work, but there is no alternative. Hunger is patient. It waits until the body falters, and then there are the people, the other survivors. Some are helpful, cautiously cooperative, exchanging information or trading supplies. I met a small group near the remains of a highway overpass. They had managed to cultivate a garden from salvaged soil and collected water. We traded what knowledge and scraps we could, directions to hidden reservoirs, advice on avoiding raider patrols, methods for keeping water clean. Their eyes, though wary, held a glimmer of humanity I had not seen in months. Others are not so. Accommodating, marauders move through the ruins, organized in small, efficient bands. They attack without warning, taking everything you have: food, water, fuel land, leaving only scars and fear. I have seen them tie up survivors, forcing them to guide them to caches, or simply executing those who resist. I know now to move silently, to hide in shadows, to trust no one fully. Even kindness can be a trap. Desperation is contagious, and it corrupts. The weather itself has become an adversary. Temperatures swing wildly. The mornings can bring freezing winds that cut through layers of clothing, while the afternoon sun smolders like molten iron. Dust storms rise without warning, obscuring vision, filling lungs, and toppling weak structures. I have been caught in one while scavenging sand and grit whipped into my eyes, my lungs burning with every gasp. I learned to hold my breath as long as possible, to cover my mouth with cloth, to seek the shelter of collapsed buildings. Yet no protection is perfect. Every storm leaves its mark. Science explains the mechanics, though explanation does little to soothe the fear. The jet streams have shifted. The polar ice caps, melted beyond recognition, have disrupted ocean currents and atmospheric patterns. Heat waves stretch across continents, parched winds carrying dust and ash. Rainfall is no longer reliable. The rain that does fall is concentrated, violent, often carrying acid from chemical runoff and pollution. It is as if the world's thermostat has been broken, and the earth is burning from the inside out. Fuel is another constant concern. I rely on a small, pedal-driven generator to keep the radio alive, but it is a fragile lifeline. Batteries must be scavenged carefully. Gasoline is almost mythic now, hidden in rusted tanks and abandoned vehicles. I ration every drop, knowing that without power, my connection to the outside world and the fragile hope it carries vanishes. Even firewood is scarce, taken from burned forests or stripped from ruined structures. Each flame is precious. It warms, it cooks, it illuminates, but it also risks attracting unwanted attention. Every day, survival becomes incrementally harder. Resources dwindle, storms grow fiercer, and marauders adapt to the patterns of those who wander the ruins. I have learned to track them, to avoid predictable routes, to anticipate raids based on their previous movements. I keep caches hidden, rotated frequently. I have turned to scavenging abandoned military depots when I can, searching for tools, weapons, and medical supplies. Knowledge, preparation, and patience are all that stand between life and death now. The crisis escalated further when reports over the radio hinted at entire regions being uninhabitable. Cities that once thrived, St. Louis, Kansas City, Chicago, purportedly abandoned or consumed by fire and starvation. Survivors are migrating in waves, creating new tensions. Refugee groups clash over water access. Scavenger bands rise to claim territories, and desperation makes morality a luxury few can afford. I hear their stories through radio chatter, fragments of conversation through static. They are warnings, guides, or sometimes just reminders of what can happen to anyone unprepared. I have started keeping a journal, documenting weather patterns, water sources, and the movements of marauders. My entries are part log, part warning, part personal confession. Today, I recorded a map of the few reservoirs I know are still flowing, their capacity dwindling with every passing week. I note rainfall patterns, soil moisture, and temperature swings. I track wind speeds and storm trajectories. Knowledge is survival, and recording it is a small defiance against the chaos. Asterisk. Science becomes not only a tool, but a lens through which I interpret the apocalypse. I understand the atmospheric chemistry that fuels dust storms, the hydrology behind evaporated rivers, the biology of plants that stubbornly cling to life. Understanding does not protect me from the storms, nor does it replenish the rivers, but it allows me to anticipate and plan. It gives me a sense of control in a world where control is an illusion. Despite all precautions, there are moments of terror. Today, while checking a water cistern in a collapsed office building, I heard footsteps behind me. A band of scavengers had tracked me, and I had only seconds to react. I dropped my pack, slipped into the shadows, and waited for them to pass. My heart pounded in my ears. The encounter ended without violence, but it reinforced a truth I have learned over and over. Survival is as much about vigilance as it is about resourcefulness. And still I cling to hope. Somewhere beyond the wastelands, there may be communities that have adapted, that still nurture life and protect it. Rumors circulate of settlements with irrigation systems, stored seeds, even clean water. Perhaps they are true, perhaps not. But the thought is enough to keep me moving, to keep me scavenging, surviving, broadcasting into the static. If nothing else, my voice can carry knowledge and warnings to anyone who might listen, helping another soul avoid the mistakes that could cost them their life. The world is collapsing, yes, but collapse is not instantaneous. It is a slow, grinding erosion of everything familiar, a relentless pressure that tests endurance and patience. Dust storms, drought, fires, marauders, scarcity, they are all parts of a single, escalating crisis. Each day adds another layer of difficulty, another test of stamina and resilience. I have adapted, and I will continue to do so. But the stakes rise daily, and the world will not forgive mistakes. Tonight, as the red sky darkens, I prepare my supplies. Water is filtered, food is counted, tools are checked. I listen to the distant hum of the wind through the shattered streets, waiting for any sign of danger. Survival is never passive, it demands attention, cunning, and unyielding persistence. Tomorrow the sun will rise, bringing new challenges, another storm, another shortage, another confrontation with desperate humanity or the wild. But I will meet it as I have met all others, with vigilance, with knowledge, and with hope. However fragile it may be, the Missouri River lies dry beneath the burnt sky, a symbol of what is lost. And yet, as I set out along its cracked banks, tomorrow I will continue to move, continue to search, continue to survive, because in this world, survival is the only resistance left, and in resistance there is still life. Asterisk, the air had grown thicker in the last week, heavy with the scent of dust and burnt earth. Every breath felt like swallowing sand. I had been rationing water, drinking only when my lips cracked to the point of bleeding. Food was a memory scraps of canned beans, a half-eaten potato I found under a collapsed counter, and the occasional rat caught in one of my traps. Fuel for the generator, the one thin thread connecting me to the world through the radio, was nearly gone. The few batteries I had scavenged were dwindling, and the pedal crank was wearing out, its gears squealing in protest. I had begun walking longer distances, searching for the smallest sources of relief. The Missouri River remained dry, but further north, survivors whispered of something, an oasis hidden among the abandoned farmlands, where water still trickled through cracked channels, where soil could still grow life. It was said that the water there was so pure it could make your throat sing, that crops somehow survived, and that a small community had thrived for years without ever leaving their perimeter. I did not know if it was true. Rumors had become a cruel currency in this world, each more tantalizing and impossible than the last. But hope, even fragile, is a dangerous motivator, and I was desperate. So I packed my meager belongings water in jugs, dried meat scraps, a small toolkit, a hunting knife, my journal, and set out. The journey was worse than I remembered roads ever being. Dust storms had buried highways under layers of grit. Entire bridges had collapsed, leaving chasms that could swallow a person without warning. I navigated through the skeletons of vehicles, the hollowed-out shells of homes, the twisted remains of fences that had once contained farms, now consumed by weeds and sand. The wind clawed at my face, eyes tearing, skin raw. I breathed through a cloth mask, inhaling only the smallest fraction of the suffocating particles. And then there were the humans, others moving through the wasteland, scavengers and raiders, desperate and violent. I saw their shadows long before I heard them, their eyes glinting in the dim, dusty light. One group had cornered a man near a half-collapsed gas station, demanding his water, his food, his belongings. He had nothing to give, and they had taken him anyway, leaving a warning in his place. Move quiet, move fast, or die. I ducked behind a ruined concrete wall, holding my breath, watching the scene unfold. Survival here was predatory. Compassion was weakness. I had encounters like this daily. A scavenger band caught me near an old gas pipeline, surrounding me with makeshift weapons pipes, crowbars, rusted rifles. I raised my hands, hoping they saw that I was unarmed. Luck was on my side. One of them, younger than the others, nodded slightly, and the group moved on, leaving me shaking on the cracked asphalt. Each encounter etched new lines into my face, carved new fractures into my resolve. Trust was scarce, and hope was scarce. But I clung to both, fragile and stubborn. The rumor of the northern oasis kept me moving. I did not know if it existed, if it was simply a tale invented to lure desperate souls into traps. But the very idea of water that could sustain life, of a place where hunger might ease even for a moment, was too powerful to ignore. I measured. My steps kept track of landmarks and avoided predictable paths. I hid during the hottest hours, moving only when the wind shifted or when scavenger groups were occupied elsewhere. Survival had become not just a physical act, but a mental one: calculation, observation, memory. At night, I rested in the remains of a schoolhouse, its roof partially caved, walls etched with soot and graffiti. The quiet was only deceptive. The wind whistled through broken windows, and the building groaned with every gust. I listened to the radio, hoping for a signal, any signal, static, whispers, the occasional burst of music from a long-forgotten station. These were treasures. I spoke into the mic, as always, recounting the day's dangers, the scarcity of food, the merciless sun. Perhaps someone listened, perhaps not, but recording my observations was an act of resistance, a reminder that I had survived. That knowledge persisted even in ruin. By the fourth day, the effects of the journey were beginning to show. My body was battered, my water nearly gone, my stomach clenched with hunger. The heat was relentless, sunburn raw against exposed skin. I saw hallucinations, mirages of flowing rivers, green trees, the shimmer of water that vanished when I approached. It was a cruel trick of the mind, a reminder that desire could betray even the strongest will. But I pressed on, every step toward. The rumored oasis was a refusal to succumb, and then I found evidence that the rumors might hold truth. A small garden, thriving amidst the ruins, fenced with scavenged metal and wood. Crops of beans, corn, and leafy greens stretched toward the sky, stubbornly alive. There was a well nearby, its water glinting in the sun. I could taste it in my imagination, the cold relief of drinking, the coolness running down my throat. But I did not approach immediately. The garden was guarded, or so it seemed, by tracks in the dust. The remnants of human life carefully preserved. I was faced with a decision that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Approach and risk confrontation, or wait and observe, hoping for an opening. Hunger, thirst, and the ache in my bones pushed me forward. I crept closer, moving silently across the cracked earth, scanning for signs of life. And then I saw them, a family, perhaps, or a small group of survivors. They moved with a rhythm of caution, tending to their crops, filling containers with water. They noticed me almost immediately. I froze, hands raised. A tense standoff ensued, eyes locked, bodies tensed. I wondered for a heartbeat if I would be shot, or driven away, or worse. Asterisk, who are you? A voice called out, sharp, wary, I'm Elias, I said. The name felt strange on my tongue, carrying the weight of months of isolation. I mean no harm, just looking for water, for food. They did not respond immediately. Instead, they lowered their tools slightly, exchanging glances. Then, one stepped forward cautiously, assessing me, my posture, the lack of weapons. You've come a long way, they said finally, and you've survived this long. That's rare, I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I've survived because I had to, because I had no other choice. There was a silence after that, the wind carrying dust around us like a veil. I felt their eyes probing, weighing the truth of my words, measuring my worth, my threat. In this world, every encounter was a negotiation, every word a potential key to survival or doom. Finally, they spoke. We've heard rumors of wanderers. You're the first to reach us in months. If you want water, you'll have to prove you can survive with us. There are rules. We share, but we also guard what keeps us alive. The challenge was clear. Trust was not freely given here. Hope had a price, and I was willing to pay it. But the test was as much internal as it was external. Could I trust them? Was this oasis real, or another cruel fabrication meant to lure the desperate into a trap? My mind wrestled with possibility and skepticism, hunger and despair. I weighed the risks, measured my desperation against the faint glimmer of hope. Asterisk, I spent the night outside the perimeter, watching. The garden thrived, tended meticulously. Water flowed in channels, plants glistened with dew, and a few animals scavenged the outskirts. It was more than rumor. It was proof that survival, somewhere, was possible, and yet the threat of human greed, of violence, of betrayal, was ever present. I had learned that nothing came free in this world. Every gift was earned, every step forward paid for in vigilance. The next day, I approached cautiously, presenting myself openly, showing respect for their boundaries. They allowed me to drink first from a small container, testing my intentions, my honesty. The water was colder than any I had tasted in months. Sweet and clean. Relief washed over me, a sensation almost forgotten. They offered me a morsel of food, a small piece of bread and dried beans. enough to sustain me for a day, perhaps two, and yet, even as I ate, I kept one eye on the perimeter, listening for the sounds of raiders or other wanderers who might see this oasis and claim it for themselves. Hope had arrived, but it was fragile, as always. This oasis could be the start of something, a community, a reprieve, a chance to rebuild, or it could be a trap, a temporary sanctuary that would vanish under the next wave of disaster, human or environmental. I knew better than to assume permanence. Survival demanded vigilance, adaptability, and the willingness to make sacrifices. The mystery of the oasis, the potential for life sustained in the desert of decay, became my focus. It gave me direction, a goal beyond mere survival. But with it came tension, the awareness that every step I took, every trust I extended, carried weight. Misjudgment could mean death. Misplaced hope could mean failure. And yet, I pressed on, because for the first time in months, the idea of survival was intertwined with something more than endurance. It was tied to possibility as night fell over. The northern plains, I made camp a short distance from the garden. My body ached from the long march. My stomach protested from the minimal food, but my spirit flickered with cautious optimism. I listened to the wind, the distant rustle of leaves, the soft trickle of water somewhere nearby. I whispered into the radio, recounting the day's journey, knowing that even if no one was listening, the act of speaking into the void was a tether to humanity itself. Tomorrow, I would learn if this community could be trusted, if their oasis could truly sustain life, if hope had a chance here. And even as uncertainty pressed in like the dust storm outside, I felt something I had not felt in months. A spark of possibility, fragile, flickering, yet undeniable. Asterisk, the morning had started quiet, almost deceptively so. The oasis lay before me, a fragile patch of green and blue amid the grey wasteland. The small community moved with purpose, tending to crops, drawing water, and reinforcing barriers. It was more than I had imagined. It was a lifeline. But there was a tension in the air, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I could feel it pressing against the edges of my consciousness. A warning buried beneath the relief of discovery. I had been allowed to stay, though always under watchful eyes. My presence was tolerated, not welcomed. And while the water, the food, and the shelter were real, the price was my caution, my vigilance, my trust. Every night I slept lightly, one ear open for the wind, one hand on my knife. Every day I observed the movements of others, scanning for signs of danger, hidden motives, or signs that the oasis itself might not endure. It was on the third day that the sky darkened in a way that froze me in place. At first, I thought it was a storm gathering in the distant dust clouds rolling over the plains, red and brown in the sunlight. But then I realized it was different. The wind shifted sharply, carrying with it a chemical temps, the acrid bite of burning soil, dust, and ozone. The temperature plummeted briefly before the sun flared through the clouds. A blistering, scorching glare. They called it a firestorm, a phenomenon that had grown more frequent over the last months, winds so strong that they carried embers from distant wildfires, turning the very air into a weapon. It could ignite anything, from dry brush to abandoned structures. The storm was advancing fast, faster than any I had witnessed before. Panic rippled through the oasis. Water barrels were secured, crops protected as best as possible, and children were ushered into shelters. My pulse hammered in my chest. Survival here was about to be tested. I sprinted toward the nearest shelter with the others, clutching what little I had scavenged: my pack, my knife, a few tins of food. The wind struck me like a wall, dust and grit clawing at exposed skin, tearing at lungs. I felt it trying to push me back, to drive me off the path, but I fought it. I could not falter, not now, not when the oasis might hold the key to life. Inside the shelter, a partially collapsed barn reinforced with metal sheets and salvaged wood, we huddled together. The storm screamed outside, a wall of dust, flame, and debris. The structure shook, groaned, and threatened to give way with every gust. I pressed my back to the wall, hands gripping my knees, heart hammering, trying to control the panicked rhythm of my breath. Through the chaos, I realized that staying put might be as deadly as venturing out. The storm would not just batter the shelter, it could ignite it. Flames were already licking at the edges of the property. I had to make a choice: stay and risk burning with the structure, or venture into the storm, relying on skill, luck, and sheer determination to survive. I looked around at the others. Some were frozen in fear, some praying, some shaking silently. The leader of the group, a man with eyes like steel and hands scarred from years of survival, turned toward me. "We can't hold here," he said. "The storm is too strong. Only a few of us can make it to the riverbed. We'll have a chance, there may be a chance to wait it out." I swallowed, the fear rising in my throat. There was no time to deliberate. Every second the storm drew closer, every gust threatening to collapse the structure. I grabbed the leader's arm. "I'll go with you," I said, my voice steady despite the terror clawing at me. "We need every hand if anyone's going." To survive this, we bolted into the storm. The world outside had been transformed. The dust whipped around us, tearing at skin, filling mouths, making every step a struggle. Embers danced on the wind like tiny predators, igniting patches of dried grass, crackling and sending sparks into the sky. I stumbled, felt my ankle twist, but forced myself to keep moving. Falling here would be fatal. Slowing down would be fatal. Halfway to the riverbed, I saw a group of scavengers approaching from the east. They had been following the storm too, seeking cover or perhaps the remnants of human settlements to plunder. Their eyes glinted with the kind of calculation only desperation breeds. They had weapons makeshift, rusted, but deadly, and they were not interested in negotiation. Survival demanded action, and I had no choice but to fight. I lunged for a fallen pipe, swinging it toward the nearest man. The clash was brutal, chaotic, a flurry of bodies, sparks, and screams. The storm seemed to roar in tandem with our struggle, as if the world itself were conspiring to crush us all. Adrenaline surged through me. I fought not for pride, not for vengeance, but for life, my life, the lives of those around me, the fragile hope that this oasis might endure. We managed to push the scavengers back, but only barely. One of our group was injured, deep gash along his arm, and we had no medical supplies adequate to treat it fully. I tore cloth from my shirt, improvising a bandage, pressing against the wound to stem the bleeding. There was no time to mourn or celebrate. The storm was relentless, bearing down upon us like a living thing. Finally, we reached the riverbed. It was dry, cracked like the back of a giant lizard, but it offered a semblance of shelter. The sides of the bed formed natural barriers against the wind, and we crouched low, huddling together, trying to conserve warmth, water, and hope. Flames flickered on the horizon, consuming what little vegetation remained. Dust choked the air. and the sky glowed red and black, as though the sun itself were dying. I took a moment, crouched against the bank, and allowed myself to reflect. Every decision I had made in the last weeks, every risk, every mile, had led to this moment. The choices that kept me alive, trusting my instincts, rationing supplies, moving carefully through the wasteland, had been tested to their limit. And now, faced with the raw fury of nature and human desperation, I understood the cost of survival. It demanded sacrifice, courage, and a willingness to face death without flinching. Asterisk, the storm lasted for hours. I kept my eyes open, alert for any movement, any threat, any sign that we might be overcome. I whispered into the radio, even though I knew it was unlikely anyone could hear me through the static. It was a ritual now, a tether to humanity, a statement that despite the collapse of the world, we were still alive, still thinking, still resisting. By nightfall, the storm began to abate. Dust settled, embers cooled, and the wind softened to a mournful sigh. The devastation was apparent. The oasis had taken damage, fences destroyed, crops scorched, some water channels blocked by debris. Yet the core remained intact, resilient, in a way that mirrored the people who tended it. We were battered, exhausted, but alive. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. Survival is not just endurance. It is resilience. It is the refusal to give in, even when every element of the world conspires against you. It is the courage to make impossible decisions, to face storms both literal and metaphorical, to continue moving toward hope even when the path is obscured by dust and fire. I looked around at the others, tired, bleeding, scared, but alive. There was a spark in their eyes, a recognition that we had survived the worst together. And for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to believe, however fleetingly, that survival was possible, that life could persist even in the harshest conditions. But I knew better than to let relief dull my vigilance. Tomorrow we would repair the oasis, rebuild barriers, clear debris, and ration supplies. Tomorrow we would face the ongoing threat of scavengers, the ever-present drought, the possibility of another storm. Survival was a cycle, never complete, never guaranteed, and yet, for tonight, we had prevailed. The storm had tested us, broken some, but it had not destroyed the spark that remained. The oasis stood, battered but unyielding, and so did we, I whispered. Into the radio one last time before sleep claimed me, my voice rough from shouting over the storm, from the strain of vigilance. We are alive. We have survived. Keep moving. Keep fighting. Hope. Hope is not gone. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a moment of rest, knowing that tomorrow would demand everything again, but also knowing that the choices I made, the courage I summoned, and the risks I took had preserved more than just life. They had preserved possibility, and in a world like this, that was everything. This section escalates tension through the firestorm, human threats, and the protagonist's life or death choices, while emphasizing resilience, reflection, and the emotional weight of survival. Elias reaches a turning point where hope and danger collide. Asterisk, the storm had passed, but its presence lingered in every cracked stone, in every singed leaf, in the air itself, heavy with dust and the acrid scent of burned earth. I stepped cautiously from the shelter of the riverbed, surveying the oasis with a mix of relief and sorrow. The green patches of life that had first drawn me here were scorched in places. Fences were toppled, and some of the water channels had collapsed under the storm's fury. Yet the core survived the main, while still held water, and the central garden, though battered, showed signs of resilience. It was a reminder that life, no matter how fragile, could endure. The people around me were shaken, yet alive. We had survived because we had chosen action over passivity, because we had faced the storm rather than letting it sweep us away. And in that survival lay the beginning of reflection. I walked slowly among them, helping where I could, lifting debris, patching leaks in the water channels, reinforcing fences with whatever materials remained. Each task was small, almost insignificant, yet necessary. These small acts of rebuilding were proof that human agency could persist. Even in the face of relentless disaster, I noticed the man whose arm I had bandaged during the storm. He sat on a fallen log, staring at the scorched ground, his face pale. Beneath the soot, "We made it," I said quietly, my voice breaking slightly with fatigue and relief. He nodded, barely lifting his eyes. "We did," he murmured. But even as he spoke, I could see the weight of the world pressing down on him. The realization that survival had not erased suffering, it had only postponed it. I moved to the edge of the garden, running my fingers over the charred soil. Plants that had survived the inferno already showed signs of recovery, small shoots, stubborn and green, pushing upward as though to defy the storm. It was almost miraculous, yet I knew better than to romanticize it. Nature, like humans, is fragile here. One wrong step, one dry spell, one wandering band of scavengers, and it could all be undone. As I worked alongside the others, I thought about the choices that had led me here. The decision to venture north, to trust the rumors of the oasis, had been risky, bordering on reckless. Every step across the wasteland had been a gamble, each encounter with desperate humans a potential death sentence. Yet, without those choices, I would be alone still, trapped in the dust and ruins of the southern plains, staring at cracked earth and dwindling supplies. My hope long extinguished, I began to understand something profound about survival. It was not just the act of staying alive, was the willingness to take risks, to extend trust, to invest in fragile possibilities. Life in this world demanded constant negotiation between caution and courage, between fear and hope. The storm had tested that balance, had forced decisions I might have avoided under calmer circumstances. And now, in its aftermath, I could see the subtle rewards of that reckoning: water to drink, soil to cultivate, companions who, despite wariness, had proven reliable. Yet the cost of hope was evident. One of the younger members of the community had been injured during the storm, a deep gash along his leg that had partially healed but left him weakened. Another, a woman with silver-streaked hair, stared at the scorched crops with silent despair, mourning the fragile life that had been lost. The storm had taken much, and in that taking, it had reminded us all of our limitations. Survival was a temporary victory, not a guarantee. I found a quiet spot near the well and knelt to drink, letting the cool water wash away the grit and grime of the storm. Each sip reminded me of the stark contrast between scarcity and abundance, between life and death. The oasis had endured, but it had not been unscathed. In that, I saw a metaphor for our existence, persistent, battered and vulnerable, yet capable of renewal. I walked along the riverbed, observing the patterns left by the storm. Dust had settled into ridges, branches had been stripped bare, and small animals emerged cautiously from hiding. Even in devastation, there were signs of continuity. Life adapted, or it perished. And we, humans, were not exempt from that rule. Every decision, every movement, every choice carried consequences that could ripple outward, shaping the fragile ecosystem that remained. As I reflected, my mind wandered to the days and weeks leading up to the storm. I remembered the long hours of travel, the exhaustion, the hunger, and the constant vigilance. I thought about the scavengers I had evaded, the desperate hands reaching for my water and food, the constant fear pressing down on my chest. Each memory carried weight, each recollection a reminder of the precariousness of life. Yet, with those memories came clarity. I had survived because I had been willing to move forward, to engage with uncertainty rather than retreat from it. The community gathered in small clusters, assessing damage, planning repairs, rationing what remained. There was a quiet resilience in their actions, a tacit acknowledgement that the storm, like all disasters, was only one chapter in a longer narrative. We were forced to rebuild, to repair, to continue. The storm had tested our limits, but it had also reinforced a crucial lesson. Survival was iterative. It was never complete, never final, never assured. Each day offered a new set of challenges, and each challenge required attention, courage, and resourcefulness. I joined a small group clearing debris from the main water channel. The task was grueling. The sun was relentless, and the work demanded strength I barely felt I possessed. Yet, as I dug, lifted, and carried, I realized that this physical labor was also a form of meditation, a way to process the trauma, the fear, the tension of the storm. Each shovel of debris removed, each branch cleared, was a symbolic act of reclamation, a statement that life could continue even when threatened by forces beyond comprehension. As evening approached, I found a moment of solitude. I sat atop a low embankment, surveying the oasis. Smoke from burned fields curled upward, mingling with the soft pink and orange glow of the dying sun. Shadows stretched long and thin across the landscape, evidence of both destruction and endurance. I allowed myself to breathe, to reflect on the fragile equilibrium we had restored. There was hope here, yet it was tempered by awareness. The world beyond the oasis remained harsh, hostile, and unpredictable. I thought about the people who had not made it, the wanderers and scavengers I had passed in the desert, the families who had been lost to hunger, thirst, and violence. Survival was selective, cruel, and often arbitrary, yet in our persistence we affirmed that life, however tenuous, was still possible. The storm had reminded us of mortality, vulnerability, and the impermanence of safety. It had also demonstrated resilience, courage, and the human capacity to endure. Night fell, and the oasis settled into a cautious calm. Fires had been extinguished, water channels repaired as best we could, and food rationed carefully. The community gathered around a small fire, sharing what they had, offering words of encouragement, planning for tomorrow. I listened, absorbing the conversations, feeling the weight of shared experience. The bond formed in the crucible of adversity. I thought about my own journey, how I had traveled across barren plains, evaded scavengers, faced the storm, and arrived here, battered, but alive. I realized that my concept of hope had shifted. It was no longer a distant, unattainable idea whispered in rumors or stories. It was tangible, embodied in water, soil, and human connection. It was the act of rebuilding, the willingness to engage. With uncertainty, the choice to act rather than surrender. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint scent of water and smoke. I closed my eyes, letting the cool night air wash over me, cleansing the tension, the dust, and the terror of the storm. I allowed myself a moment of gratitude, not for perfection, not for safety, not for certainty, but for survival itself. For the oasis, for the people who had weathered the storm with me, for the fragile spark that persisted despite everything. I realized, too, that survival required more than physical endurance. It demanded reflection, understanding, and adaptation. Each disaster, each encounter, each choice had taught me something essential about the world and myself. I was stronger, more vigilant, more attuned to the delicate balance between risk and reward, hope and despair, action and patience. As I sat in the quiet aftermath, I understood that the storm had not ended. Our challenges had revealed them more clearly. Scarcity remained, danger lingered, and the environment continued to push against us. But we had endured, we had acted, decisively faced fear, and emerged with the possibility of continuity. That realization, fragile as it was, carried weight far greater than any comfort. The night deepened, and I prepared my small space near the well, careful to conserve water, organize supplies, and rest what remained of my strength. Sleep came reluctantly, but it was welcomed nonetheless. Dreams were fragmented, haunted by dust and fire, yet interwoven with images of water flowing, plants growing, and human voices speaking words of resilience and hope. When I awoke, the world was quieter, still raw, but alive. The sun cast long shadows over the remnants of the storm, illuminating both destruction and renewal. I rose, stretched, and joined the community in tending the oasis, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Survival was no longer merely an instinct. It had become a mission, a commitment to life itself, fragile but fiercely defended in the reflection. Of the water, I saw the face of someone changed, worn, scarred, yet steadfast. I had survived storms, human threats, and environmental collapse. I had faced fear, desperation, and uncertainty, and I had chosen to act, to move forward, to risk and endure. The aftermath was not perfect, the world not healed, but there was a sparks, fragile but undeniable, and in that spark I found the courage to continue. Asterisk, the morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet soil and smoke from the fires that had finally died down. The oasis was battered, bruised, and imperfect, but it had survived. Standing at the edge of the well, I traced the ripples of water with my eyes, watching the reflection of the hazy sun above. It was a small thing, yet it felt monumental. Reminder that life, even in this fractured world, could persist. I had learned something in the storm, in the struggle, and in the quiet moments afterward. Hope was not a grand revelation. It was not an answer written in the sky. It was fragile, small, easily threatened, and yet remarkably persistent. A green shoot pushing through charred earth, a child's laugh despite hunger, a water channel that still flowed after hours of relentless wind and fire. These were the sparks that mattered. I moved through the oasis, checking on the people who had survived with me. Some were already tending to the crops, patching fences, or cleaning the debris. Others rested, silent and exhausted, processing trauma in their own way. We were a small community, bound not by shared history, but by shared survival, by the knowledge that the next storm could come at any moment. We had no illusions that life would return to normal, that the world could be rebuilt as it once was. Survival here was not about restoration. It was about endurance. I walked along the riverbed, noting where the storm had gouged the earth, where water had pooled, where the soil had begun to recover. Even in devastation, nature demonstrated resilience. Tiny sprouts had begun to emerge. From the scorched ground, fragile reminders that life adapts and continues. Perhaps it was symbolic, or perhaps it was just biology, but I allowed myself to see it as a sign. Even in the harshest circumstances, there was potential, yet hope alone would not sustain us. Resources remained scarce. Water had to be rationed. Carefully, crops needed tending, and fuel was limited. Raiders and scavengers would not disappear. They would continue to roam the wasteland, seeking what we had struggled to preserve. Survival demanded vigilance, ingenuity, and the courage to face each day as if it were a battle. And it was a battle. Every step forward, every decision, carried the weight of potential life or death. I thought about the storms yet to come, the droughts, the heat waves, and the wandering bands of desperate humans. They were inevitable. I had no illusions about the future, but I also understood that survival was not about certainty. It was about persistence. It was about choosing to act, to move forward, to protect what small fragments of life we could manage to keep. Each day, each decision, was a reaffirmation that we refused to surrender completely to the chaos. I returned to the shelter and sat, quietly, listening to the subtle sounds of life around me, the trickle of water, the soft murmur of conversation, the occasional laugh. There was still fear, still tension, still a sense of precariousness that hung in the air like dust. But there was also determination. Even in the smallest gestures, I saw a commitment to continue, to endure, to live. I reached for the radio, the same device that had connected me to the world beyond the wasteland, and spoke softly into it. If anyone is listening, we are here. We survived the storm. We have water, food, and shelter, though just barely. We are not safe, not by any measure, but we endure. And if you can hear this, know that survival is possible, even when the world seems entirely lost. I paused, considering the weight of my words. I knew few, if any, would hear them. But speaking into the static was a ritual, a reminder that our existence mattered, that our persistence was a testimony to the human spirit. Even in a world that had stopped making sense, we could still act, still choose, still hope. Night fell again, and I lay beneath the canopy of trees that had survived the storm, feeling the cool breeze against my skin. My body ached, my mind was weary, but my heart carried a small flame of resolve. The future remained uncertain. Tomorrow could bring another storm, another attack, another loss. But for tonight, we were alive. We had survived. That was enough. I thought about the fragility of hope. It was not heroic or grand. It was quiet, almost imperceptible. A hand reaching for a water barrel, a community gathering to repair a fence, a seedling pushing through charred soil. These small acts, repeated and multiplied, formed the basis of endurance. The storm had shown me the cost of survival, but it had also illuminated its possibility. Even battered, even broken, life could persist. As I drifted toward sleep, I reflected on what I had learned over the months of wandering, struggling, and surviving. The world had changed irrevocably, and we had changed with it. Fear had sharpened our instincts. Loss had deepened our appreciation for the small victories. And hope, delicate though it was, had become the most valuable resource of all. I did not know what tomorrow would bring. I did not know if the oasis would survive another storm, if scavengers would find us, or if disease or famine would strike. There was no finality in this world, no closure, but I had enough to keep going, enough to fight for one more day, one more sunrise, enough to continue despite uncertainty, despite fear, despite the crushing weight of reality. The radio hissed. Softly beside me, a reminder that even in isolation, we are not entirely alone. Somewhere, perhaps, others were listening. Others were surviving. Others were waiting for a spark, for a signal that persistence was possible. And in that thought, I found a measure of peace. Our lives, our choices, our determination, these were not meaningless. Even in a world that had stopped, even in a night that seemed eternal, our presence mattered. I whispered into the darkness, not for anyone else to hear, but for myself, as a promise and a plea. Keep moving, keep fighting, stay alive, stay human. The world is broken, but we are still here. And as long as we breathe, there is a chance. The night stretched on, quiet now, the storm long gone. And though the wasteland remained harsh, the future uncertain, and survival an ongoing struggle, I allowed myself a small, fragile thought. Perhaps life could endure. Perhaps humanity could endure. Perhaps, against all odds, hope was not entirely lost. I closed my eyes, feeling the exhaustion settle over me, and let the stillness of the night sink in. Tomorrow we would rise again, face the world as it was, and continue the delicate, relentless act of surviving. Tonight, I rested knowing that we had made it this far, that our choices, our courage, and our endurance had preserved a small fragment of life, and with it, a small fragment of hope.